Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant. Today, I'm going to be revisiting Dungeons and Dragons by discussing this book, the 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons Monster Manual. This one I bought at Coaz. It is a first printing copy. It doesn't have signs of wear and tear, as far as I can tell. I bought it for $17.50, and, I already have PDFs from online, and I've used the hell out of them. But I've never paid for the book, and though this doesn't pay Wizards of the Coast directly, I did buy this secondhand because I wanted this book in hard copy. So, this book is credited to Mike Merles, Steven Schubert, and James Wyatt. And what I really love about this book is just the plethora of monsters. I know anyone familiar with 4th edition is going to say that early design for monsters was whack. It was very miswritten, poorly edited, and I'll agree with all of that. It isn't a well put together edition of D&D, especially in the early phases of the design. I do want to clarify that because the game is amazing. I really love 4th edition, and the game I played for a year and a half as a GM mostly relied on core books: Player's Handbook 1, Player's Handbook 2, Monster Manual, Dungeon Master's Guide, and then some of the additional ones like Heroes of the Feywild, Underdark, Heroes of the Elemental Chaos. So I did expand into additional sources, but it was very limited. Martial Power 2, Divine Power, Martial Power and Martial Power 2, Divine Power, Primal Power. I did use some of those books and allow them, but the core of the game used those core books. So I didn't really expand into Monster Manual 2 until partway into the game, and I still haven't really gone through Monster Manual 3. I know it is where the math became better, but for my intents and purposes, I could do small tweaks to the enemies and it would work for what I needed in the game. And that's what I really liked about it, that even though the math wasn't great, it only required small fixes to really work the way I wanted it to. And what I'm going to do with this is highlight some of my favorite monsters in 4th edition that I know they're not as good as the later printings, but they worked for what I needed and really gave some variety to the encounters, because the game I ran used a lot of human and Yuan-Ti enemies, and trying to find related enemies was not the easiest. I also used a lot of goblins, and so between those 3 types, I was trying to stick to human, goblin, and Yuan-Ti stat blocks while understanding that at some times I could go and pull a human from a different book, or, I could use a lizard man stat block and make it work, or a gnoll stat block and make it work for what I wanted it to. I understood that, but what I used was primarily the monsters in this book as explicitly what they were stated to be. So, one thing I really liked was that the goblins have so many options. Once you get to page 135, you see bugbears, which are one of the types of goblins. But then you also see on the next page, 136, goblin cutters, and then their tactics, goblin black blades, and then their tactics, goblin warriors, and these are all level 1 creatures that you could see. And a lot of their stat blocks were in the book that I used, which was the Forgotten Realms campaign guide, because I was using the Loudwater module in the first chapter of that book. But it did have a lot of these enemies already in it. There was a goblin sharpshooter, goblin hexer, Goblin Skull Cleaver, and now you're getting into level 2 and level 3 enemies. Goblin Underboss, and now you're at a level 4 enemy. And goblins are supposed to be low level enemies, and I did use them from time to time afterwards, but they were always easy to kill once the players got to level 3 or level 4. And that's where I really liked that the Loudwater module has a plot hook for a hobgoblin tribe that is attacking a nearby town, besieging it, and that gave me a nice hook that I could expand into and use enemies that were made for slightly higher level encounters. The Hobgoblin Grunt is a minion for level 3, for example. The Hobgoblin Warrior is a level 8 minion. The Hobgoblin Archer, a level 3 artillery. The Hobgoblin Soldier, a level 3 soldier. And then, the Warcaster, level 3 controller, and is also a leader. And then the Hobgoblin Commander, which is a level 5 soldier, also a leader. And with my game, I incentivized getting to that threat early, so that way they wouldn't be fighting under-leveled enemies and I wouldn't have to do extra work. By the time they got there, they were already level 4, and I think they got to level 8 or 7 by the end of that adventure that I planned for them, taking a 2-paragraph prompt, that adventure hook, and expanding it into a multi-session adventure. And I did that by incorporating use of wolves, that these hobgoblins were riding wargs, and then I took the wolf statistics and modified them slightly. And now, because wargs are really high level for what I needed, a level 9 brute, for example, that's way too powerful for the mount of a hobgoblin. They're not going to be riding those. Not even a dire wolf, which is a level 5 skirmisher. That could easily defeat any hobgoblin. So I increased the size, or rather borrowed the size from the warg, and gave them the Grey Wolf stat block. And both of these are on facing pages 264 for wolf and 265 for warg. And that really suited my needs. And now you have a bunch of hobgoblins riding wolves and really wargs, and serving a matron who is I forget if the hook says that she's a warg or a winter wolf, something in that ballpark, that she is leading this tribe and directing it, and then involving, hey, the normal routes between Succomber in one spot and Loudwater in another, those routes that caravans would take are being overrun by these warg riding hobgoblins. And having all of that relatively easily obtained in the monster manual made my job significantly easier. A lot of my time was spent clicking between different pages. Now that I have this book, it'll be significantly easier. And the way that plotline resolved was that the adventuring party went through a northward route along the river, but on the opposite bank of the river, where there were still hobgoblin patrols, but significantly fewer. And by getting to Succomber from across the river, they were able to get in, help out, and one of the player characters rejoined them. He was on the walls defending Succomber, and all of the enemies were pulled straight from the monster manual, and I really enjoyed that I could, flip back and forth all within the same book. So the humans, there's human enemies, the rabble and lackeys, which are just minions, level 2 and level 7 respectively. The bandits and the guards. And guards I used as a replacement for bandits, that a bandit ambush would have some skirmishers, those that are labeled human bandit, which are a level 2 skirmisher, but then they would also have frontline guys that would attack sword and shield, or in this case with halberds, that would run up and attack the party on the front lines. Those were the guards, and what I liked about that, and I'm going to show that right up here. I know it's not going to focus, but you can kind of see like the word human and then all the stat blocks on both pages. What I really loved about this and what really irritated me as well was the human guard, which I was using as a bandit, has a halberd, which they attack at will, and then if they hit, the target is marked until the end of the guard's next turn, which meant that whoever was on the front line has to target that guard or take a -2 penalty to their attack rolls. And then additionally, they have a powerful strike which uses that same halberd, does additional damage, and the target is knocked prone. And this brings in to play two mechanics that I really enjoyed, and I think the party enjoyed too. The recharge mechanic, which I really enjoyed, which at the start of the turn, you roll a die, a six-sided die. If it matches the two values shown in the stat block, which in this case it recharges on a 5 and a 6, then you get that ability back. So that was really cool. And then the additional part is that the target is knocked prone. And I really like trying to hamper my players. And what I liked about 4th edition game design is that it gave so many ways to do that. But for the most part, during the levels that they were fighting humans, the two frontliners were a warlord who was kind of a skirmish frontliner. He wasn't always at the front line, and a barbarian who was very good at dealing damage in the front lines. The downside being that he was also a dwarf. And this brought up one of his mechanics, which is that these enemies are obviously going to try to make the frontliner go down however they can to bypass him and get to the wizard or the warlock or the warlord, people that aren't on the front lines. This also gave the dwarf player a chance to survive and show off his prowess. Dwarves automatically get a saving throw if they are subjected to certain conditions, including being knocked prone. And in 4th edition, a saving throw is a success if it is a roll between a 10 and a 20. And with a d20, that means it's a 55% chance of success. And I forget, in my Discord, I can probably find it in the server where we were doing this, but it went something like 19 trip attempts, like 17 different game sessions before he was finally knocked prone. Despite only having a 55% chance of success, the dwarf was only knocked prone like 4 times the entire year-and-a-half campaign. Between levels 1 to 10, out of dozens of attempts to knock him prone, 4 times. But it created this sense of like, I'm so stalwart, I can stay at the front lines, I'm this guy that is making them pay attention. The barbarian felt better about the game because there were these mechanics that, when they failed, affected the morale of the enemies even better. And what I like to do as a GM is have recurring enemies that enemies are going to try to run once 50% of them are dead on the battlefield, or if they meet certain conditions. And a lot of these times, the guards were kind of the sacrificial front line, so that if people started going down, the skirmishers could get out, or they could try and knock down the barbarian or the warlock, knock them prone, so that way they could get out. And very few times did that happen, because they'd try to knock the barbarian prone, he would stay standing, and then their move action to get out of the combat would then provoke an attack of opportunity. So these blocks were really fun. The human berserker, which uses a great axe, and then when they become bloodied, which is half health, they get an additional melee basic attack with a +4 bonus on the attack roll and deal an extra d6 damage on the hit. So not only are these guys already dealing 1d12 +4 damage, but then they get an additional 1d12 plus 1d6. It's a cool mechanic, and in 3rd edition, stat blocks didn't have that, and I don't think they really have anything similar to it in 5th edition either. If the barbarian enemy gets to half health, they're just at half health. They have all their options remaining. But in 4th edition, once they got bloodied, once they got to half health, they become more of a threat. And sure, it's only once, the first time they're bloodied in an encounter, but it gives them something more to do. And that's what I loved about the 4th edition monster manual. One thing I also really loved was the Kobold Slinger is a level 1 artillery that I used some math to increase, +1 per 2 levels kind of thing. When they were going through a swamp, they encountered a very young black dragon that was just free from its nest and was trying to establish a home in this swamp. And the kobolds were there to protect it, there to help it. And the kobold slingers have a really cool mechanic that I then used as like a thing that the kobolds interacted with the hobgoblins, sold them this ability, like these items, which could then increase the value, the experience value of the hobgoblin, but make the hobgoblin encounters slightly different. The slingers have a special shot where they can fire special ammunition from its sling. They carry 3 rounds of special shot chosen from the types listed below. A special shot that hits deals normal damage and has an additional effect depending on its type. The stink pot, the target takes a -2 penalty to attack rolls and a saving throw ends that. The fire pot does fire damage and the target takes ongoing 2 fire damage until a saving throw ends that condition. And the glue pot immobilizes the target with a saving throw that ends that. So these kobold merchants had traded with hobgoblin merchants and gave some of the hobgoblin artillery, the skirmishers, these glue pots or these stink pots, and that really changed the dynamic of different combat encounters, because now the warlock could be immobilized by hobgoblins, and it only really works once. Once the players know that is a possibility, one, they expect better rewards. And so what I did was any hobgoblin that hadn't used 2 of these special shots during an encounter would have whatever their remainder was available for loot, and then the players could use that as like a lobbed grenade or something like that. So, one, the players expected something more as a reward for this new kind of edited stat block. And I really liked it because it changed the dynamic of the encounter. The warlock who was skirmishing is now stuck in place and a target, so the paladin or the barbarian has to come in and help him. And that's one of the things that I really loved about the 4th edition monster manual as well. So I didn't use a lot of enemies in here. I used, goblins, kobolds, humans, UNT, wolves, a couple scattered about, dragons, that kind of thing. But the UNT are a very powerful enemy, and so I had to reduce the strength of the listed stat blocks, which gave me another exercise in modifying enemies to fit the encounter, to fit the level of the adventure. I thought it was really cool because UNT were a credible threat because they were so powerful. So I really liked it. The Snake Tongue Initiate is a human cultist that worships the same god that the UNT pray to. And that's a level 7 minion, so I could reduce the effectiveness or even just keep it the same. It's 75 experience and a 20 AC, 18 fortitude, and 17 reflex and will. And by level 5, that was really something that didn't hinder the players. So overall, the 4th edition monster manual, I really enjoyed it. There are so many different things you can pull from it and modify to fit what your game needs. It isn't the best math, and there are plenty of resources online to advise you on how to fix certain enemies, or they'll often say just look at the Monster Manual 3 and anything related to that, or it's a program that you can modify enemies on the fly. There's just some really good resources, and the Monster Manual served as the basis for that. So I really love this book. I know I only paid $17.50 for it. I'm getting my money's worth out of it. And I just really like having a hard copy of books for role-playing games that I play. And I just cannot emphasize enough how much I love 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons, and this right here is one of those aspects. So, the 4th edition Dungeons and Dragons Monster Manual, worth my money. If you play 4th edition, I think even if you have to adjust the numbers, you're going to get your money's worth out of this book as well. So, yeah, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to another used book rant.